All right, so you're looking at a map, and there it is, plain as day, the Lakshadweep Sea. Simple enough, right? Just a patch of ocean next to some islands. But uh, as you know, here on the Deep Dive, we love to dig a little deeper. Even with something like a name on a map, we often find some really amazing stories.
Exactly. You might have seen it pop up recently,
Mm.
especially when the Maldives are in the news.
Yeah, you know what I mean. And to get to the bottom of this, you shared with us some fascinating excerpts from an article by the Maldivian historian Muhammad Naajih,
That's right.
sometimes called Naajih Didi.
That's right. And his perspective as someone from the Maldives is particularly valuable here.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to unpack this whole Lakshadweep Sea thing. Where did that name come from? How does it relate to the Maldives? And what's the historical and geographical context we need to keep in mind? So to do that, we're going to be looking at the names themselves, the islands, of course, and how they've been represented on maps throughout history.
Right.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is Lakshadweep?
Okay, so geographically speaking, Lakshadweep is a union territory of India. It's situated in the Arabian Sea.
Huh.
To the west of mainland India, and importantly, just north of the Maldives.
Okay.
Now, here's something interesting. Lakshadweep actually forms the northernmost tip of a pretty significant underwater ridge. It's called the Maldive Ridge, or sometimes the Lakshadweep Ridge.
Oh, wow.
This ridge continues southward, encompassing the Maldives and then further down to the Chagos Archipelago, covering a huge area of roughly 20,000 square kilometers.
Whoa, 20,000 square kilometers. That's a big underwater connection. Now, you mentioned Minicoy earlier.
Right. Minicoy is a very interesting case. Historically, it was actually a part of the Maldives up until 1752 CE. But even though it's now part of Lakshadweep, the culture and the Divihi dialects spoken there, they still have really strong ties to the Maldives.
Huh, interesting.
Unlike the rest of Lakshadweep, which is more aligned with the Malabar region of India, culturally and linguistically.
Wow. So even though they're separate now, it sounds like they have a shared past. So I'm picturing Lakshadweep in my head, and I kind of have this image of a huge chain of islands. Am I on the right track?
That's a common misconception. The reality is a bit different.
Okay.
Lakshadweep does have 12 atolls, but they're tiny compared to the atolls you find in the Maldives.
Huh.
Naajih Didi actually compares them to the little reefs, or pharaohs, within the larger Maldivian atolls.
Interesting.
All in all, there are only 39 islands, and out of those, only 10 are actually inhabited.
Wow.
The total land area is quite small, just 32 square kilometers.
Yeah.
However, because these atolls are scattered over a wide area, their territorial waters and exclusive economic zone are actually quite extensive, 20,000 and 400,000 square kilometers respectively.
Really? Wow, that's a lot of sea for not a lot of land.
Exactly.
So that's the geography. But what about Lakshadweep's history as like a political entity?
Well, that's a really key difference compared to the Maldives.
Okay.
There's absolutely no record of Lakshadweep ever existing as an independent nation with its own government or anything like that.
Huh.
As Naajih Didi points out, apart from Minicoy's historical link to the Maldives, the cultural connections really lie with the Malabar region. And over time, these islands were under the control of various South Indian rulers. And then, of course, they came under British rule.
Right.
The British administered them as the Lakshadweep, Minicoy, and the Maldives Islands.
Okay.
After India gained independence in 1947, these islands became part of the Dominion of India. First as a part of the Malabar district of Madras Presidency.
Gotcha.
But they were later reorganized in 1956 as a separate union territory. And finally, in 1973, the name was officially changed to Lakshadweep.
So historically, Lakshadweep has always been part of a larger entity, not an independent kingdom like the Maldives.
Precisely.
So that brings us to the name itself, Lakshadweep. I mean, it sounds kind of grand, right?
It does.
And we know Dweep means island, but Laksha means 100,000. That seems like a bit of a stretch for just 39 islands, don't you think?
Right.
So how does this name, meaning 100,000 islands, connect to the much larger Maldives and this Lakshadweep Sea we're talking about?
That's a great question, and Naajih Didi brings up this very point. The name itself comes from Sanskrit,
Okay.
where Laksha means 100,000, and Dweep means island. And this meaning is consistent in Malayalam and the Jasri dialect spoken in Lakshadweep,
Okay.
except for Minicoy.
Right, right. So how did a place with just 39 islands get a name meaning 100,000 islands? Did they count differently back in the day?
Well, it's possible that Laksha wasn't always meant literally. It might have just been a way to express a really large, almost countless number of islands.
Like a way of saying that there are tons of islands here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating is that this seemingly exaggerated number
Hmm.
actually has a connection to the Maldives as well.
Oh, really?
The Isdu and Danbidu Loama Afanu, which are 12th century CE copper plate grants from the Maldives,
Yeah.
referred to the Maldives as Lakshadweep, which was also translated as 100,000 islands.
So a historical document from the Maldives used the same 100,000 islands term for the Maldives themselves.
That's right.
That's wild.
And Naajih highlights that in this historical context. Lakshadweep was definitely referring to the Maldives,
Okay.
possibly to emphasize just how many islands are there.
Okay.
He also notes that the more common Divihi name for the Maldives that we see today is Divihi Rajah, meaning the island kingdom, which emphasizes their long history of self-governance.
Okay, so that really highlights the contrast, doesn't it?
Yep.
We have Lakshadweep, part of a larger entity, and then we have the Maldives, a fully independent island kingdom. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So unlike Lakshadweep, the Maldives has a really long history as an independent nation,
Right.
with its own government going all the way back to ancient times. Naajih points out that their self-governance has only been interrupted very rarely throughout history. Even during British colonial rule in the region, the Maldives remained under their own kings and ministers, and the name Divihi Rajah really reflects that legacy as the independent island kingdom.
So geographically, are the Maldives on a completely different scale compared to Lakshadweep?
Oh yes, much larger.
Okay.
Situated south of Lakshadweep, the Maldives stretch for about 870 kilometers.
Wow.
And they have 26 atolls, a lot more than Lakshadweep,
Okay.
around 1,200 islands total,
Mhm.
186 of which are inhabited.
Okay.
The land area is about 300 square kilometers, and their territorial waters, an exclusive economic zone, are also significantly bigger than Lakshadweep's, 41,490 square kilometers and 859,000 square kilometers, respectively. And the Maldives are also a lot more populous.
So even though both island chains are part of that same underwater ridge,
Right.
they're on very different scales, historically and geographically.
Absolutely.
All right, so we have Lakshadweep, a union territory of India with a name that hints at a whole lot more islands than it actually has, historically linked to mainland India. And then you have the Maldives, a much larger independent nation
Right.
with its own long history, also historically referred to with that same 100,000 islands idea,
Yeah.
but clearly on a much grander scale. So with all that in mind, let's look at how this whole Lakshadweep Sea name came about. According to Naajih, it's actually a pretty recent term. How recent are we talking?
Very recent in the grand scheme of things.
Okay.
Naajih actually shares a personal story in his article about encountering the name Lakshadweep Sea for the first time. He saw it as Lakshadweep Sea
Okay.
on a map of the Maldives in a geography exam back in 1993.
Wow, so he had never even heard of it before.
He was quite skeptical, actually, when he saw it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't a common name back then, when did it actually become official?
Well, according to Naajih research, it was officially adopted in 1953, with the third edition of a publication called Limits of Oceans and Seas,
Okay.
put out by the International Hydrographic Organization.
So the IHO is basically the global authority when it comes to naming oceans and seas.
That's right. And they officially adopted this name in 1953. And this is important. This was after India gained independence.
Oh, interesting.
The first two editions of this publication,
Okay.
published in 1928 and 1937, made no mention of a Lakshadweep Sea at all.
Really?
They referred to the sea up to Minicoy as the Arabian Sea,
Okay.
and the area, including the Maldives, was considered part of the Indian Ocean.
Wow. So this was a pretty significant change after India became independent.
Yes, it was.
So why 1953? Was there a specific reason why they chose this name right after India's independence?
That's a good question. Naajih doesn't really go into detail about the exact reasoning behind it. But the timing does suggest a connection to India's new status as an independent nation,
Uh-huh.
maybe a way of establishing some regional maritime influence.
Makes sense.
The 1953 publication defined the Lakshadweep Sea as stretching from Sadashivgad in India
Okay.
down to the Coradiv Shoal, and it included all of Lakshadweep and all of the Maldives on their western side, all the way to the southern tip of Adu Atoll and towards Sri Lanka.
Wow. So it encompassed both Lakshadweep and the entire Maldives.
Exactly.
But Naajih says it wasn't commonly used even after that.
That's right. He mentions that even Indian writers at the time, when referring to Lakshadweep, they often continued to place it in the Arabian Sea,
Okay.
because that was the established name.
Right.
The change from Lakshadweep Sea to Lakshadweep Sea, he argues, really happened after India renamed the islands themselves in 1973.
Okay.
So the implication is pretty clear here.
Yeah.
The sea was named after the Union territory.
So first the islands were renamed and then the sea was renamed.
That seems to be the case.
Okay. But from a Maldivian perspective, this must raise some questions, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Naajih really emphasizes that the Maldives has always seen itself as being in the Indian Ocean. He even quotes a line from their national song, which translates to, "It's the Maldivian archipelago that shines like a bright pearl in the Indian Ocean." They don't really object to the ocean being named after the historical Indian subcontinent,
Okay.
but they find it a bit strange that the sea surrounding the Maldives is named after this much smaller Union territory.
Yeah, because it's like the Maldives, this independent nation for centuries, is suddenly in a sea named after a part of a neighboring country.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about all these geographical names we see on maps and take for granted, and the stories behind them.
You're right. And what's more is that even today, modern maps, like Google Maps, they still show the Lakshadweep Sea stretching all the way up to Adu Atoll in the Maldives.
Wow.
And Naajih makes an interesting suggestion. If we really need a specific name for the sea that includes both Lakshadweep and the Maldives, then Maldives Sea would actually be the most historically accurate choice.
Okay.
Because older maps actually labeled that underwater ridge as the Maldive Ridge, which has now been changed to Lakshadweep Ridge.
It's like these naming conventions are constantly evolving.
They are.
And they really reflect these power dynamics and different perspectives on history.
Definitely.
Okay, so just to recap, we've learned that Lakshadweep, despite its name, doesn't have all that many islands.
Right.
And it's always been part of some larger entity. While the Maldives are this much larger independent nation.
Right.
And the Lakshadweep Sea, this name that we see on maps today, it's actually a pretty recent invention, seemingly tied to India naming its union territory.
Yes, and it all comes back to Naajih main point about perspective.
Yeah.
Looking at the history and geography from a Maldivian point of view really gives us a very different understanding of this seemingly straightforward name.
It really does. It makes you wonder, what do these geographical names tell us about history and national identity and how we see the world?
Absolutely. And it's something for you, the listener, to think about. Are there other examples of place names that carry this kind of historical or political weight? You could even look at historical maps yourself, or research the history of organizations like the IHARO. You could even explore the cultural connections that still exist between the Maldives and Minicoy. That would be fascinating.
So much to explore.
So much.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. It's amazing how even something as seemingly simple as the name of a sea can have such a deep and complex history.
You said it.
Hopefully this is giving you a new understanding of the Lakshadweep Sea and the fascinating stories of these island chains.
I hope so.